Welcome back, everyone, to Popcorn and Spooky Stuff. Today, we're going to go ahead and do a recap and review of Episode 2, American Horror Story, 1984. Episode 2 is titled Mr. Jingles. After last week's episode, we have Mr. Jingles, who escaped the mental hospital and arrived at camp along with the Night Stalker. Right now, we're going to go ahead and focus on Mr. Jingles, and Dr. Karen Hopple has arrived at the camp. She is looking for Margaret to warn her that Mr. Jingles is out and ready to get his revenge. Dr. Karen arrives in one of the cabins, and it so happens to be Margaret Booth's cabin. She's looking around in the dark, and out of nowhere, Margaret Booth pops out of the dark. As the doctor is trying to warn Margaret that Jingles has escaped the mental hospital, Margaret becomes very cold and standoffish about this new information, and pretty much doesn't even care what the doctor is telling her, not even listening to her warnings. She tells the doctor that she has God on her side, and afterwards she pulls a gun out and says that if Jingles comes after her, he will regret it. Pretty much after Margaret kicks out Dr. Karen out of her cabin, Karen drives away from Camp Redwood and is leaving, leaving everyone behind. As she's driving, she doesn't get very far as one of her tires becomes flat after hitting something sharp in the road. Now, instead of just, driving on the rim or, anything other than just sit in a car in the dark, knowing that Jingles is out there, she just sits there and waits. And of course, a car pulls up, and it's the pickup truck that Jingles took from the auto shop after killing the auto shop employee. So Dr. Karen just sits in the car and allows this dark figure to walk closer to her. Mr. Jingles, as he gets closer, picks up the sharp object that was in the road, and I am unsure if Dr. Karen realizes at this point who it is, but she pretty much just watches him as he gets closer to her vehicle. She starts to get a little bit spooked out and rolls up her window, but I don't understand, what is that going to do? It's not really going to protect you much. Just maybe try to get out of the car and run at this point. So she talks to the guy as he gets closer to the car, standing right in front of her door, and thanks him for helping her. And he bends down, and she looks at him and sees that it's definitely Jingles for sure. And he pretty much kills her at that point. And he pulls her out of the car, breaks her leg, and then he stabs her with that sharp object that he had to use to blow her tire out. Afterwards, he cuts her ear off, and that is it. Dr. Karen is dead. Now we are back with Brooke and Montana, who are in a cabin talking to each other. Brooke expresses her frustrations with the Night Stalker and Mr. Jingles, and really questioning if everything that she's seen is real, and just feeling very, traumatized by the entire ordeal. Montana comforts Brooke, and as she does, Brooke opens up about the events that occurred last summer at her wedding. As Brooke is telling her story, we have a flashback, and we see her walking down the aisle with her dad, and we see her groom standing before her. Now, off the bat, we see the groom. He is not smiling, which is a little odd in this situation. He should be happy. He has a beautiful bride. This should be the happiest day of his life. But it appears like something is bothering him. And he just seems very upset about something. Well, as Brooke approaches him and they're about to say their I do's, he pauses and will not say I do. Brooke kind of shakes him and says it's okay. And the groom's best man kind of like tries to comfort him and say, hey, like just go ahead and do it. Like you're fine. This is what you want. The groom all of a sudden like turns around to his best man and says, is that what you said to her last night? And everyone is kind of like in shock about this whole situation. Brooke and the best man are like, what are you talking about? And the groom goes on and says that he saw his best man walk into Brooke's apartment and he spent the entire night and didn't leave until morning. And this clearly has made him jealous and frustrated, and he is very upset about this whole situation. Brooke is trying to tell him that nothing happened, that he knows that she has a hard time sleeping by herself, and that they are in love, that they were each other's first loves, first kiss, and she's been saving herself for him as he has for her, that there's nothing to worry about, that the best friend just stay there so she would feel safe at night. Guys, this is pretty much like the wedding from hell because things escalate so quickly. Out like a fit of rage, he pulls out a gun, kills his best friend, and then Brooke's dad gets up and he shoots her dad as well. Then he turns to Brooke and he points the gun at her. You think he's gonna go ahead and kill her as well. But he basically tells her that, look what you made me do, and then tells her that she'll never be a wife, and then shoots himself in the head. With blood splatter all over the place, Brooke is covered in his blood and breaks down and cries. Now, this is all from Brooke's perspective, and she is a storyteller of this tragic event that she is telling Montana. And we kind of also see the importance of the diamond ring from episode 1 that the Night Stalker was looking for. So we still need to figure out like why the Night Stalker wanted that particular ring. I don't know if it's because of this tragic event that somehow Satan told him to get that ring that is like somehow cursed. I don't know. But this was a horrific event, and I have to say I love how they played Billy Idol's White Wedding after it was all said and done. But poor Brooke, that was tragic. Next up, we have Margaret Booth, who breaks up the little party in the cabin and tells our camp counselors that they need to go ahead and call it a night, and they need to separate the females from the males. The males need to go ahead and take their night shower so they're pure and clean in the morning and ready to work. After the power is cut off, we notice that Brooke once again is walking around camp by herself in the dark while there's 2 possible killers lurking around camp. I don't know what's going on with Brooke. I don't know if she's that naive or if she may just be psychotic or hallucinate these things, or maybe she's looking for trouble or planning her own murders. I don't know. I just find it odd how she always ends up by herself walking around camp. What is she looking for? Why is she going out by herself? Like, there's so many questions about this. Like, I don't understand. She should be, like, with Montana or, someone else. But she's not. She's by herself walking in the dark. As the guys are in the shower area, Xavier discovers that the camp showers are definitely not like a hotel. There's not going to be a little soap and a washcloth for him. And the guys kind of laugh at him because he had these high expectations and it's just not realistic. Xavier then tells everyone, hey, like, I'm going to go get my beach towel and I will be right back. As Xavier is going to the cabin, he is pulled into a vehicle, and he knows the guy who pulled him in is this creepy, slimy dude, and he wants Xavier to call him daddy, and it appears that this guy is like a porn director of some sort, and he found Xavier on the streets, and he was a drug addict, and he got him cleaned up, and he pretty much used Xavier as like a porn star because has good looks. Xavier expresses that he no longer wants to do that. He wants to be a real actor, like Michael J. Fox, and he isn't interested in that lifestyle anymore, so please leave him alone. Well, this guy is stalking him, and he's the one who called him in episode 1 saying that he was going to get him. Xavier then tries to change the focus from him to Trevor and tells him that if he looks at Trevor, it's something better than what he can offer. In the next scene, we cut back to Brooke, who has managed to go ahead and sit by the dock and sit alone by the water. As she's staring up at the moon, something bumps into her feet. She looks down, and it is the corpse of Dr. Karen. Of course, Brooke jumps up and screams, and as she turns around, she sees her friend, the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker laughs and tells her that he's going to kill her and lunges at her, trying to stab her. Brooke manages to hit him in the head and run away. The Night Stalker proceeds to chase her, and as the Night Stalker is catching up to Brooke, all of a sudden, he bumps into the hitchhiker. Now, this is a surprise of events because in episode 1, we saw the hitchhiker was killed by Mr. Jingles, or at least we thought he was when Brooke saw him. So clearly, from the American Horror Story past seasons, it's easy to assume that the hitchhiker is a ghost. The Night Stalker, being the killer that he is, on knowing that the hitchhiker is a ghost, goes ahead and slashes his stomach and then kills him. He continues to chase after Brooke, but has a ways of catching up to her. In between the chase, we cut back to Nurse Rita, who's in the infirmary. She's dancing, having a good time. All of a sudden, she hears some jingles, turns around, and Mr. Jingles is right there in front of her. What's going to happen? The Night Stalker is still on the hunt for Brooke. Again, the hitchhiker appears, and he tells him he shouldn't be there. The Night Stalker is clearly, shocked to see the hitchhiker is walking around alive and asks him, why are you not dead? The hitchhiker has no idea that he is dead or a ghost, and he has no way of answering this question. So the Night Stalker wastes no time and stabs him again in the neck to try to kill him again. This time he pulls an ID off of the hitchhiker, and the ID is dated 1970. We then come back to our male camp counselors who are done with their showers. They come out to discover a dead man is outside of the shower area, and it is the guy that Xavier was talking to. Now, Xavier, a few moments earlier, had brought him over the shower area so he could take a look at Trevor. Now, Xavier left right at the most perfect time to step away from this moment, and right after, daddy, or Blake, was stabbed and killed. So after the male counselors discover this corpse, Xavier pops up and pretends not to know him and is acting just as shocked as everyone else. At this point, the girls also join the guys because they hear the screams. Flipping back to the Night Stalker, we see that he wanders into Margaret Booth's cabin. I don't understand why Margaret's not locking her door. Anyway, Margaret introduces herself to him, and she is much more polite to him than she was Dr. Karen. So, what's going on there? Anyway, she starts to have a conversation with the Night Stalker. She asks him what his name is, and he tells her it's Richard Ramirez. They then seem to have a chit-chat session by the fire as she cleans one of the cuts off of his forehead. She seems to be very compassionate with him and listening to him as he tells his story of his abusive childhood. Margaret then goes on to tell him how what he's doing is God's work and he shouldn't feel bad for that. Now, this is just a very odd conversation that Margaret shares with the Night Stalker. She doesn't show any fear towards him. She doesn't seem to be bothered that he's a killer. And he also tells her that he tried to kill someone, but they didn't die. And he shows her the ID. Now, one thing to point out is when the Night Stalker first entered her cabin, he had the ID and told her to tell him about this. And Margaret, I don't know if she did it on purpose, but when she started having the conversation, the heart-to-heart with him, she never really answered his question about the ID of the hitchhiker. So I don't know if that was on purpose or for whatever reason they didn't explore that, but it seems like she is trying to outsmart him in this situation, and she's definitely not going to tell him the entire truth. Margaret does tell the Night Stalker, though, that he needs to get rid of Mr. Jingles, but not kill Jingles, only get Jingles away from the camp. So what exactly is going on with Margaret? I'm not 100% sure yet. Things just are not adding up here, and she is not coming across as a good person that she is portraying herself. In the next scene, we're back with our camp counselors, and they are freaking out. They definitely believe Brooke now that there is a killer at camp, and they jump in the van and they try to take off and just leave. Well, as any slasher movie, we know that one, it took a while to start up the van, and then two, when they finally did start it, they immediately crashed right after. Nurse Rita jumped out, and they ended up swerving and hitting Margaret's car, totaling the van. So Nurse Rita has a cut, and she seems to be injured, but she's going to be okay. After the accident, we cut back to Margaret, who's walking around camp, and she finds the hitchhiker. She clearly knows him, and the hitchhiker glances at her, and he says, "Margaret, you look different." And she tells him, "You look the same." She tries to explain to him that he has to be dead, that there's no way that he would look exactly as he did in 1970. The hitchhiker seems to have no memory of that night. Margaret seems to quiz him as to what he saw, who was chasing him, and he has a flashback of Margaret. Now, in his flashback of Margaret, she is all bloody, and it looks like her hair is in pigtails. So if we remember in episode 1, Margaret, when she had told her story, she looked a little bit different than his version of her back in 1970. She asked him, like, what he saw when he looked in the cabin, and he says that he saw Margaret. Now, one could say that he saw Margaret injured, he saw Margaret sleeping, or possibly he saw Margaret killing the other camp counselors. Now, he then goes on to tell Margaret how he was hurt that night. It comes back to him that he was a coward after he looked in the window and he ran, and he was crossing the street and he was hit by a vehicle. The vehicle was driven by Mr. Jingles, who came out, and as the hitchhiker was crying in pain, Jingles killed him. So we don't really know who to believe at this point. Was Margaret a victim? What exactly did the hitchhiker see? And also, why is that night so blurry in his memory? After wrecking the van, our group of camp counselors and Nurse Rita decide to split up in two groups. Trevor has the keys to his motorcycle, but they're in the cabin, and they need to also go to the infirmary. So the two groups split up at this point. We discover that Xavier starts freaking out when he is in the cabin. He goes ahead and breaks down and tells the truth that he did know the guy who was killed, and he apologizes and just has like a mental breakdown to the point where he is unable to really get up off the floor. Both the infirmary and the cabin, all of a sudden we see that someone is knocking on the door at both doors. So both killers, we assume, are trying to get in. So we believe that the Night Stalker has headed towards the infirmary and Jingles is towards the cabin. And everyone is freaking out, and that is pretty much the cliffhanger of this episode. What's going to happen? Is anyone going to die? Who's going to walk in through that door? We'll see in episode 3 when we continue the next review. So let me know what you guys think. I think this episode was full of fun. I really enjoyed the highlight of the wedding scene. I thought that was pretty cool. And I felt bad for Brooke. But at the same time, I don't know if I trust her storytelling. It just seems like a lot of tragic events are happening to her, and I don't know if they're made up or if they're real and they've just made her insane. I don't know. And then Margaret is just kind of everywhere. Like, one, she never locks her door, so these people are just like randomly walking into her cabin. She had different attitudes towards the doctor and towards the Night Stalker. She just seems to be a little bit crazy. But we'll talk more in our episode 3 review. I want to say thank you guys for listening and watching. And if you like this video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks, and bye.